Okay, stop. Before you click away, I need you to understand something. This is not a weird video. This is not a gross video, and it's definitely not one of those history videos that's secretly just an excuse to make everybody uncomfortable for 20 minutes. This is actually one of the most fascinating mysteries in all of human history. Because think about it. For at least 300,000 years, human women have been dealing with menstruation. 300,000 years. That's longer than cities have existed, longer than agriculture, longer than writing, longer than literally every civilization you've ever learned about in school. And yet, if you open most history books, you'll find page after page about kings, wars, pyramids, empires, swords, ships, taxes, roads, and occasionally some guy named Marcus who conquered something. But one of the most universal experiences in human history, almost nothing. Which creates a genuinely fascinating question. How exactly did ancient women handle their periods? Because modern menstrual products are incredibly recent. Disposable pads didn't become common until the 20th century. Tampons are even newer. Period underwear would sound like science fiction to most people who lived before electricity. So what happened before all of that? What did women in ancient Egypt do? What about Greece, Rome, China, medieval Europe? What happened when a woman got her period while crossing a desert, sailing an ocean, fighting in a siege, or trying to survive a brutal winter? And perhaps even more interestingly, why were so many ancient men absolutely terrified of menstruation? Because once you start reading historical texts, you discover something strange. Ancient people didn't just misunderstand periods. Some of them genuinely believed menstruating women possessed supernatural powers. Not good powers, terrifying powers. Powers capable of ruining crops, spoiling food, destroying weapons, and in one particularly impressive case, causing entire storms. Which raises another question. If menstruation was viewed with so much fear, how did women actually navigate daily life? Because unlike kings and philosophers, periods don't care about cultural beliefs. They arrive anyway, every month, for thousands upon thousands of years. And the solutions women developed are far more sophisticated than most people realize. In fact, some of them were surprisingly modern, others were genius, and a few are going to make you very grateful you were born in the 21st century. Let's start at the beginning, or at least as close to the beginning as history allows. Imagine you're a woman living 20,000 years ago. No cities, no governments, no writing, no recorded history, just small groups of hunter-gatherers moving across landscapes that would feel almost alien to us today. What do you do when your period starts? The frustrating answer is, we don't know. And that uncertainty exists for a very simple reason. Menstrual products are terrible fossils. Think about it. Stone tools survive, bones survive, pottery survives, but cloth, leaves, plant fibers, animal fur, those materials disappear. They decompose. They return to the earth, long before archaeologists arrive with brushes and notebooks. It's one of the biggest blind spots in human history. The people who made civilization possible often leave behind the fewest clues. But even though physical evidence is scarce, anthropology gives us some hints. Many hunter-gatherer societies documented in more recent centuries used absorbent plant fibers, moss, animal hides, soft bark, or simply layered clothing to manage menstruation. And while it's impossible to know exactly what Paleolithic women used, there's a good chance their solutions weren't dramatically different. Because humans are remarkably good at solving practical problems, especially when they've had hundreds of thousands of years to practice. But here's where things get interesting. The oldest surviving evidence isn't actually about products, it's about beliefs. And beliefs often tell us more than objects ever could. Because across the ancient world, menstruation wasn't viewed as merely biological. It was symbolic, powerful, mysterious, sometimes sacred, sometimes dangerous, and occasionally both at the exact same time. Which brings us to ancient Egypt. Because ancient Egypt, as usual, was doing something completely different from everyone else. If you study enough history, you start noticing a pattern. Whenever the ancient world had an incredibly strange belief, Egypt usually had an incredibly practical one. While other civilizations were debating whether women were cursed by supernatural forces, Egyptians were busy writing medical manuals. The famous Ebers papyrus, dating to roughly 1550 BCE, contains detailed discussions about women's health. And while it doesn't read like a modern gynecology textbook, it demonstrates something important. The Egyptians were paying attention. They were observing. They were documenting. And most importantly, they were treating menstruation as part of ordinary life, not as evidence that someone could accidentally destroy your wheat harvest by walking past it. Researchers believe Egyptian women commonly used softened papyrus fibers and linen cloth, which makes perfect sense. Papyrus was everywhere. Linen was one of the most common textiles in Egyptian society. The materials were absorbent, reusable, and relatively comfortable. Honestly, by ancient standards, it was a surprisingly elegant solution. But the cultural side is even more fascinating. Ancient Egypt connected female fertility to larger natural cycles, the flooding of the Nile, the renewal of life, agricultural abundance, the rhythms that sustained civilization itself. Menstruation wasn't necessarily celebrated, but it also wasn't treated as an existential threat to public safety. And compared to what comes next, that made Egypt unusually progressive, because then we arrive in ancient Greece. And ancient Greece had a problem, a very specific problem. Ancient Greece produced some of the greatest thinkers in human history. Mathematicians, philosophers, scientists, people whose ideas still influence the modern world. Unfortunately, some of those same people had absolutely no idea how the female body worked. Take Aristotle, one of the most influential thinkers who ever lived, a man whose writings shaped Western civilization for centuries. Aristotle believed menstrual blood was essentially failed semen. Yes, really. That was the theory. The idea was that both men and women attempted to produce the same reproductive substance, but women were supposedly colder and biologically weaker, so the process didn't fully succeed, and the result became menstrual blood. From a modern perspective, this sounds completely absurd, because it is. But here's the important thing. People believed it for hundreds of years, and beliefs shape behavior. Once a society starts viewing menstruation through the lens of biological imperfection, all kinds of strange cultural assumptions start growing around it. Emotionally unpredictable, spiritually complicated. Not because anyone had evidence, but because the prevailing theory already assumed something had gone wrong. And yet, despite all this confusion, Greek women still needed practical solutions. Most historians believe wool was commonly used, soft wool pads, absorbent cloth, early forms of internal absorbent materials, simple technologies refined through generations of experience. Because while philosophers argued about biology, women were solving real-world problems. And that's something you'll notice throughout this entire story. The people writing history often understood menstruation less than the people actually experiencing it. Then comes Rome. And this is where things become genuinely ridiculous. Because Rome gave us roads, aqueducts, engineering marvels, legal systems, architectural achievements that still stand today, and somehow also produced one of history's most spectacular collections of menstrual myths. Meet Pliny the Elder, Roman scholar, naturalist, professional collector of bizarre opinions. According to Pliny, a menstruating woman could sour wine, kill crops, rust metal, drive dogs insane, repel storms, and damage mirrors. Which raises an obvious question. If menstrual blood was powerful enough to manipulate weather systems, why wasn't Rome putting women in charge of military strategy? The answer, of course, is that none of this was true. But what's fascinating is why people believed it. Because throughout history, humans tend to mythologize things they don't fully understand. And menstruation was deeply mysterious to ancient observers. Every month, apparently healthy women experienced bleeding without injury. The process followed predictable cycles. It influenced fertility. It seemed connected to pregnancy. And all of this occurred long before modern medicine could explain any of it. When people encounter something powerful and poorly understood, they often default to supernatural explanations. That's not stupidity. That's human nature. It's how mythology begins. It's how religion begins. And sometimes it's how very strange Roman books get written. Ending about history is that we often remember the loudest stories, the emperors, the battles, the revolutions, the monuments. But most of human life didn't happen on battlefields. It happened in homes, in villages, around fires, in conversations between mothers and daughters. And for hundreds of thousands of years, women passed down knowledge about menstruation the same way they passed down everything else that mattered, through experience, through community, through trial and error, through survival. Because periods didn't wait for scientific breakthroughs. Women had to solve the problem long before anyone understood the biology behind it. And they did, across deserts, across mountains, across civilization, across every continent where humans live, generation after generation, long before modern medicine, long before disposable products, long before history books thought their stories were worth recording. And maybe that's the most fascinating part of all. Not how ancient women handled their periods, but how much human history was built by people whose knowledge never made it into the official record. Because while kings were busy conquering empires, half of humanity was quietly solving problems that every future generation would inherit. That's history too, and it's about time we started treating it that way.